Welcome to the History in Focus channel. Be sure to subscribe so you don't miss more videos like this one.
In the popular imagination, the Wild West is all orange sunsets, high noon duels, and unbeatable heroes. But when the dust settled and the guns went quiet, what really remained were bodies, graves, and a lot of unanswered questions. Today we're going to dig into exactly that. How some of the most famous figures of the West really died, and why, in many cases, their deaths were just as strange. Ironic or mysterious as their lives. Tilt your hat, check your holster, and come with me. Billy the Kid, the teenager who turned into a ghost. Before he became a legend, Billy the Kid was just Henry McCarty, a skinny orphan drifting through a violent New Mexico. He lost his father early, his mother as a teenager, was abandoned by his stepfather, and by 15 he was already stealing food to survive. He didn't start with some spectacular heist. It began with butter. He got arrested, escaped through a chimney, and that set the pattern for his life. Crime, jail, escape. At 17, in a fight with a tough blacksmith named Frank Windy Cahill, Billy snapped, pulled his gun, and fired. Cahill died the next day. From that moment on, the shy kid became a full-time fugitive. During the Lincoln County War, he chose a side, the Regulators, backing John Tunstall. When Tunstall was murdered, Billy swore revenge and dove into a spiral of blood. A sheriff executed in broad daylight, ambushes, gunfights. The newspapers exaggerated, and he didn't bother to correct them. One day he claimed, "I killed a man for every year of my life." 21. In reality, probably far fewer. In the legend, far more. Caught by Pat Garrett, a former saloon buddy, Billy was sentenced to hang. The date was set, chairs counted, rope ready. But 5 days before he was supposed to die, he decided he wasn't accepting that ending. Smuggling a gun, he killed 2 guards in the Lincoln jail and escaped in chains, even asking for a pickaxe on the courthouse balcony to break the shackles, right in front of a whole town frozen in shock. 3 months later, his luck ran out. On July 14th, 1881, at the Maxwell Ranch, Billy walked in barefoot, with no visible weapon, into a dark room, asking in Spanish, "Quién es? ¿Quién es?" He was just looking for meat for dinner. In the dark, Maxwell whispered to Pat Garrett, "That's him." 2 shots. 1 bullet went straight through the kid's chest into his heart. The outlaw who seemed untouchable dropped dead in seconds. Or did he? Almost immediately, rumors spread that Garrett had killed the wrong man. Decades later, 2 old-timers, John Miller in Arizona and Brushy Bill Roberts in Texas, swore they were the real Billy the Kid. They knew intimate details of his life. One even asked the governor for an official pardon. Modern DNA tests couldn't settle it. In the cemetery at Fort Sumner, a gravestone fenced in by iron bars reads, "Pals." Inside that stone cage might lie just a 21-year-old kid, or one of the biggest cases of mistaken identity in the history of the West. Jesse James, rebel hero, betrayed killer. Jesse Woodson. James grew up in Missouri, torn apart by the Civil War. The son of a preacher, he saw Union soldiers invade the family farm, his mother beaten, his stepfather tortured. At 16, he joined one of the most violent units of the war, the Confederate guerrillas under Bloody Bill Anderson. There, he learned ambush, lightning raids, and the coldness it takes to kill at close range. When the war ended, the South was in ruins, and Jesse was now an ex-rebel with no job, no land, and a heart full of hatred. The solution he found was simply to keep the war going, now with different targets, banks, trains, and symbols of Yankee power. Their first robbery in 1866 was historic. They hit a bank in broad daylight in Liberty, Missouri. During the escape, an innocent college student was killed. It was the start of his fame and his trail of blood. For 15 years, the James Younger gang terrorized the Midwest. Daring robberies, unbelievable getaways, letters to newspapers in which Jesse painted himself as a victim of Northern oppression. A Southern sympathizing editor turned this violent robber into a kind of American Robin Hood. The problem is, unlike the myth, there's no record of Jesse handing money to the poor. The cash stayed with the gang, the cost stayed with the victims. In 1876 came the disaster in Northfield, Minnesota. The small town fought back. Armed citizens faced the gang in the streets. Some gang members were killed, others captured, and the younger brothers ended up behind bars. Jesse and Frank barely escaped, wounded, hunted, humiliated. That was the proof. The charm of the legend didn't protect anyone from the bullets of angry townspeople. Even so, Jesse didn't stop. He recruited new men, younger and less loyal. Among them were brothers Robert and Charlie Ford. When the governor of Missouri put a $10 bounty on Jesse's head, dead or alive, Bob Ford didn't see a Confederate hero. He saw an opportunity. On April 3, 1882, in the modest house where Jesse lived under the fake name Thomas Howard, he made a mistake he never made. He took off his coat, took off his guns, and stepped up on a chair to straighten a crooked picture on the wall, unarmed, back turned, at ease. Behind him, Bob Ford raised a gun and shot the most wanted man in America in the back of the head. Jesse died instantly, in front of his wife and children. Bob rushed to turn himself in, expecting applause. He was first convicted of murder, then quickly pardoned as arranged with the governor. But the label that stuck was another: the coward who shot Jesse James in the back. Folk songs started singing the betrayal. 10 years later, in a bar in Colorado, a stranger pulled the trigger on Bob Ford. The traitor died at 30 and became just another ghost tied to the myth of an outlaw who, to this day, swings between bloodthirsty villain and romantic rebel. Wyatt Earp, the gunfighter who refused to die by the gun. When we think of the Old West, his name pops up almost automatically. Wyatt Earp, the man with the badge, the gunfight at the OK Corral, the long-coated figure walking out of a cloud of smoke untouched. But behind the legend was someone far more complicated. Wyatt was born in 1848, roaming the frontier with his family, doing a bit of everything: wagon driver, buffalo hunter, even facing horse theft accusations. He only really settled into a role when he pinned on a lawman's star in rough towns like Wichita and Dodge City. There, he met men like Masterson and Doc Holliday, dealing with drunks, crooked gamblers, and professional gunmen. His big moment came in Tombstone, Arizona, a silver boomtown of saloons and rising tension between the Earp brothers and a cowboy faction tied to the Clanton and McClory families. Months of threats, provocations, and mutual humiliations, until, on October 26, 1881, everything blew up. In less than 30 seconds, the gunfight at what became known as the OK Corral left 3 men dead in the dirt. Virgil and Morgan Earp were wounded. Doc was grazed. Wyatt walked away without a scratch, again. The press split the country. Were they brave heroes who faced down outlaws, or easy trigger killers? A judge eventually cleared the Earps, but the bill came due soon after. Morgan was shot in the back while playing billiards. Virgil was ambushed and left crippled. Devastated by his brother's murder, Wyatt dropped the formalities of the law and led his famous vendetta ride, hunting down and killing suspects across the Arizona plains. After that, he turned into a nomad of the modern world. Saloons, business ventures, mining, horse racing, boxing referee, speculation in growing towns. Eventually, he settled in California with Josephine Marcus, his companion for decades. In Los Angeles, surrounded by cars, early movie studios, and planes in the sky, Wyatt advised writers and directors on how to recreate a West he had actually lived through, and often embellished. The most surprising part? No one ever managed to shoot him down. While contemporaries like Doc Holliday, Wild Bill Hickok, and Jesse James fell to bullets, illness, or murder, Wyatt slipped through the end of the 19th century and into the 20th relatively quietly. On January 13, 1929, at 80 years old, the most famous gunfighter of the West died in his bed in Los Angeles of natural causes. No duel, no ambush, no dramatic close-up, just an old ex-lawman closing his eyes. In fiction, gunfighters always die with guns in their hands. In real life, the man who embodied the duel myth exited with a sigh, not a bang. Wild Bill Hickok, the dead man's hand. James Butler. Hickok, Wild Bill, looked like he'd been designed to be a character. Tall, long hair, huge mustache, the stance of someone who'd seen too much and would rather you not test your luck. He was a scout, army tracker, lawman, and professional gambler. In towns like Abilene, Kansas, where violence was routine, he gained a reputation as a calm, fast gun. Hickok had a habit that bordered on paranoid but made perfect sense in the West. In saloons, he always sat with his back to the wall, facing the door. He never, ever let anyone walk up behind him. It was his only shield against betrayal. On August 2nd, 1876, in Deadwood, South Dakota, something broke that pattern. At the Nuttall and Mann Saloon, his usual seat was taken. He even asked the man to trade places, but the answer was no. Reluctantly, he sat with his back to the entrance for the first time in years. The poker game went on. Cards, chips, muffled laughter. Then Jack McCall walked in, a young man nursing a grudge after losing money to Hickok the day before. Humiliated, when Hickok gave him a little cash for breakfast, he carried more than anger. He carried a gun. He walked up from behind, yelled something like, "Take that!" and shot Wild Bill in the back of the head. Hickok died instantly. The cards slipped from his hands, 2 black aces and 2 black eights. That combination would forever be known as the dead man's hand. McCall was arrested, acquitted in a makeshift first trial, then retried in another jurisdiction and hanged. Wild Bill's legend only grew, a gunfighter who always feared a shot in the back, and died exactly that way on the one day he broke his own rule. Buffalo Bill Cody, the man who wouldn't let death rest in peace. William Frederick. Buffalo Bill. Cody did it all. Buffalo hunter for the railroad, Army scout in wars against native peoples, Medal of Honor recipient, stripped and later restored, and above all, showman. His Buffalo Bill's Wild West show toured the United States and Europe, bringing cowboys, sharpshooters, native performers, and staged battle scenes to fascinated crowds, including queens, popes, and anonymous multitudes. Buffalo Bill helped build the myth of the West, and like any good myth builder, he mixed truth with exaggeration. Some of his war exploits are questionable, some numbers are clearly inflated, but his charisma was undeniable. At the same time, he was full of contradictions. He hired native performers at pay rates better than average, but reinforced stereotypes. He championed women like Annie Oakley, yet had a turbulent marriage. One year he was rich, the next broke again, thanks to bad investments in mines, towns, and wild projects. As he grew old, the show lost steam. The public wanted movies and new thrills. The Old West was already the past. In January 1917, sick and worn out, Buffalo Bill went to stay with his sister in Denver. He died on January 10th of kidney failure at 70. But his death wasn't the end of the story. It was the start of a bizarre fight. One will said he wanted to be buried on Lookout Mountain near Denver with a panoramic view of the Rockies. An earlier document suggested he preferred Cody, Wyoming, the town he'd founded. The result was a symbolic tug-of-war between Colorado and Wyoming over the body of the man who personified the West. Because of heavy snow, the burial was postponed. His body stayed in a mortuary for months, being embalmed and re-embalmed. When he was finally laid to rest on Lookout Mountain in June, the people of Cody were furious, insisting that wasn't really his body. Legends spread that they had snuck in at night, stolen the real corpse, and taken it to Wyoming. To make sure no one messed with the grave, workers poured tons of concrete on top. Armed guards even patrolled the site. As a final twist, the Ollinger mortuary, where the body stayed for half a year, later became a restaurant with a darkly funny name, Linger. Today, people sip cocktails there without realizing that the man who sold the world a theatrical version of the West once lay there, parked on ice and formaldehyde, while his final resting place was contested. Buffalo Bill turned his life into a show, and somehow managed to make even his burial feel like one last performance. Doc Holliday, the man who feared a boring death. John Henry. Doc Holliday was born to be a middle-class dentist in the American South. He studied, graduated, opened to practice. His future seemed settled: a chair, a drill, patience, routine. Then came tuberculosis, young coughing blood, hearing doctors say he didn't have long and needed a dry climate. The West called him more as a sentence than an adventure. Out West, nobody wanted a dentist who coughed blood. Doc discovered another talent: cards. He became a professional gambler in saloons thick with alcohol, smoke, and guns. At the table, he realized that besides bluffing, he needed to draw fast, and he learned. From then on, Doctor was almost a joke. He was taking more lives than he was fixing teeth. Doc was volatile, sarcastic, alcoholic, but fiercely loyal to those he respected. In Tombstone, his friendship with Wyatt Earp became legendary. When tensions with the Cowboys exploded at the OK Corral, he was in the middle of it, shotgun in hand. He's often credited with the shot that dropped Tom McClory. When later asked if he felt fear, he supposedly said he only feared a meaningless death. And what would a meaningful death be for a gunfighter? Probably collapsing in a dusty street, gun smoking in front of dozens of witnesses. Doc seemed to be chasing that, but the disease was faster. Thin, exhausted, coughing blood, he tried one last remedy in Glenwood Springs, Colorado: mineral baths that promised healing. In reality, the sulfurous water made his tuberculosis worse. By 1887, at 36, Doc looked more like a broken old man than a glamorous gunfighter. Lying in a bed, staring at his own bare feet, he is said to have smiled and muttered, "This is funny." The irony was brutal. The man who expected to die with his boots on in a fight was leaving the world in a bed. Barefoot, no gunfight, no audience. He died there quietly in a boarding house room. The exact location of his grave was lost over time, but the image of the dangerous, tubercular dentist who lived like every day was his last is still very much alive. Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, bloody end or perfect getaway. Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid sound like made-up movie names, but they were flesh-and-blood men with serious skill. Robert Leroy Parker, the future Butch, grew up in a Mormon family, working hard until he met Mike Cassidy, a charismatic horse thief. He learned outlaw life from him and later took his last name. The nickname Butch came from a perfectly honest job in a butcher shop. Butch wasn't the usual impulsive outlaw. He planned robberies like a chess game, studying schedules, routes, blind spots. He had a rule: avoid killing. He wanted money, not corpses. Harry Longabaugh, the Sundance Kid, came from a different angle. Jailed as a teenager for horse theft in Sundance, Wyoming. He earned his nickname the hard way and left prison more dangerous than before. Together, they formed the core of the Wild Bunch. From hideouts like Hole in the Wall, Wyoming, they pulled off train and bank robberies with a level of efficiency that terrified railroad companies. They blew up train express cars with dynamite, sometimes a bit too enthusiastically, scattering bills across the ground, but they still walked away with fortunes for the time. That fame brought a worthy enemy, the Pinkerton Agency. With wanted posters, reports, telegraphs, and relentless detectives, Pinkerton agents started closing in. One by one, gang members were killed or captured. Butch and Sundance realized the board was stacked against them. In 1901, they made a radical move. They fled the United States. With Etta Place, Sundance's mysterious companion, they sailed to South America. They bought a ranch in Patagonia, tried their hand at ranching, posed in elegant clothes for portraits. For a few years, it looked like they'd retired from crime. But the pull of robbery was strong. Soon they were back to robbing banks and payrolls in Chile and Argentina. Etta vanishes from the record around 1907. No one knows if she returned to the U.S., died, or reinvented herself under a new name. But Butch and Sundance show up again in 1908 in Bolivia, accused of robbing a mine's payroll. Cornered in a village called San Vicente, they spent the night under Bolivian gunfire. Accounts differ. Some say they died in the firefight. Others claim that when one of them was badly wounded, the other helped him with a mercy shot before turning the gun on himself. 2 bodies were buried in unmarked graves. And then the story splits in 2. The official version, they died there in 1908, unknown, erased in a foreign country. The alternative, they survived. Neighbors swore they saw Butch living decades later in the U.S. under another name. A man called William T. Phillips allegedly confessed in private that he was really Butch. One of Cassidy's sisters claimed he visited the family in secret in 1925. Attempts to exhume Bolivian remains and match DNA haven't settled the question. Maybe they died in a shabby Bolivian house. Maybe they escaped and grew old in anonymity. The world never got a clear answer, and that's exactly what keeps the duo alive in our imagination. 2 thieves who may or may not have cheated death. Annie Oakley, the sharpshooter who left with a heart in tow. Phoebe Ann Mosey seemed destined to vanish in the poverty of an Ohio farm. Her father died early, the family went hungry, and an 8-year-old girl headed into the woods to hunt so they could eat. The rifle became an extension of her body. Selling game quite literally kept her mother and siblings alive. By 15, her reputation as the girl who never missed was already spreading. A hotel staged a shooting match between her and Frank Butler, a professional marksman. He hit 24 out of 25 clay pigeons, and he hit all 25. Frank lost the bet and gained a wife. Instead of feeling threatened, he became her manager and life partner. On Buffalo Bill's show, Annie Oakley became a global star. She shot coins out of the air, sliced cards in half at long distances, and fired over her shoulder using a mirror. People say she once shot a cigarette from the Kaiser of Germany's mouth. Queen Victoria, European nobles, crowds across countless cities. Everyone wanted to see the petite woman in a long dress perform miracles with a gun. Offstage, Annie was almost the opposite of the aggressive gunslinger stereotype. Religious, disciplined, no bad habits, generous with orphans, and especially with other women. She insisted they learn to shoot to protect themselves, decades before anyone talked about empowerment. In 1901, disaster struck. A horrific train wreck left Annie with serious injuries to her spine and limbs. 5 surgeries, braces on her legs, chronic pain. Anyone else would have ended their career. She didn't. She returned to the stage, adapted her acts, and proved her willpower was as sharp as her aim. Years later, her health began to fail. Pernicious anemia, a weakened body. On November 3rd, 1926, Annie died at 66 in Ohio. Frank, her partner for half a century, collapsed emotionally. He stopped eating, stopped sleeping, lost all interest in life. 18 days later, he died too. Some doctors call this broken heart syndrome. Emotional stress so extreme that it physically damages the heart. In their case, 2 graves side by side hold not only one of the West's most unusual couples, but proof that sometimes the most accurate shot in a person's life isn't from a gun. It's choosing who walks beside you. Calamity Jane, Between the Lie and the Last Request. Martha Jane Canary was born into a family barely able to stay upright. She lost her mother early, her father soon after, and was left responsible for several siblings on a frontier that had no patience for weakness. Her solution was simple and radical. She walked away from what anyone expected of a lady. She cut her hair, put on pants, learned to ride, shoot, and survive like any cowboy. She worked driving cattle, carrying messages, and possibly as an Army scout. She told stories of heroics, ambushes, daring rescues. The archival record doesn't back up everything, but Jane clearly understood that in the West, whoever told the story loudest often got believed. Her nickname, Calamity Jane, has competing origins. Some say she saved a commanding officer and was christened Calamity to his enemies. Others say trouble and disaster just followed her everywhere. The fact is, she drank hard, caused plenty of chaos, and at the same time helped the sick during epidemics, especially smallpox. The most sensitive part of her legend is her supposed relationship with Wild Bill Hickok. Jane swore they were lovers, even secretly married, and that they had a daughter. Official records point to a different reality. He tolerated her to some degree, but there's no proof of a romance. Even so, she repeated the same story until the end, and as often happens, sheer repetition gave her a kind of posthumous truth. But after a stint as part of Buffalo Bill's show, ending with her being fired for showing up too drunk, Jane spiraled into poverty, alcohol, and odd jobs in mining boomtowns. In 1903, with a body wrecked by decades of abuse, she fell ill on a train bound for Deadwood. She died a few days later in a cheap hotel. The death certificate says pneumonia. People who knew her were sure alcohol did a lot of the work. Before she died, she made one request: to be buried next to Wild Bill Hickok in Mount Moriah Cemetery. Many in Deadwood thought it was outrageous. Why put a woman they branded a tramp beside a revered hero? But the request was granted. To this day, their graves lie side by side, fueling guided tours that happily repeat the story of the great love that probably never happened. Jane used lies to build herself, the public used those lies to craft a romance, and in the end, only one part really mattered to her: resting forever near the man she said she loved. Bat Masterson, from Bloody Plains to a typewriter. Bartholomew. Bat Masterson crossed the Kansas frontier when the West still meant buffalo herds, native nations, fresh railroad tracks, and violent towns popping up overnight. He started as a buffalo hunter, picked up a scar and a permanent limp in a saloon gunfight where a dance hall girl, possibly his lover, died from a bullet meant for him. After that, he became an Army scout, a deputy in Dodge City, and a county sheriff. He saw his brother Ed die in his arms after being shot by a drunken cowboy he was trying to disarm. He buried friends, faced soldiers, gunmen, and armed drunks, and walked away alive from all of it, marked but breathing. Over time, he got tired. The West was changing. Railroads were bringing civilization, and open violence was giving way to courts and businessmen. Bat did something almost unthinkable for a gunfighter. He moved to New York City with his wife Emma. There, he traded his gun belt for a suit and became a sports columnist specializing in boxing. He still carried the past in his eyes, but in practical terms, he was a different man. He wrote harsh critiques, analyzed fights, hung out in cafes, and talked with young reporters who saw him as a living relic of a world they knew only through stories. On October 25th, 1921, Bat went to the paper as usual, sat down at his desk, rolled a sheet into the typewriter, and started another column. In the middle of a sentence, his heart quit. He slumped over the keys, dead, with his last piece still in the machine, unfinished. A man who'd spent years watching people die on dusty Kansas streets fell quietly in an office chair surrounded by walls, newspapers, and big city noise. If the Old West was a blood-stained chapter, Bat was one of the few who managed to flip the page and literally write another life, right up to the last second. John Wesley Hardin, The Final Sermon. You could easily devote an entire episode just to him. John Wesley Hardin, a preacher's son, named after a church founder, still managed to rack up one of the bloodiest records in the West. At 15, he killed his first man in a fight. From then on, the deaths piled up. He claimed to have killed 42 people. Historians confirm about 21. Nothing was too trivial to spark his rage. Union soldiers, Texas Rangers, civilians, anyone who crossed his path at the wrong time. His most famous, and likely true, story involves a man snoring too loudly in the next hotel room. Hardin supposedly fired a shot through the wall and killed him. Years later, he joked, "They say I killed 6 or 7 men for snoring. That's a lie. I only killed 1. But blood always demands interest." In 1877, the Texas Rangers finally caught him. Sentenced to 25 years, he served 17. Behind bars, he studied, became a lawyer, and wrote a self-serving autobiography full of excuses and warped memories. In 1894, he was pardoned and walked out as a new man, Dr. Hardin, attorney at law. The problem is, a temper like his doesn't vanish with a diploma. In El Paso, he swapped the Bible and law codes for bars, drinking, and trouble. He got involved with a client's wife, made enemies, and appears to have tried to use lawmen to solve personal problems in the most permanent way. One of those lawmen was John Selman. On August 19, 1895, Hardin was shooting dice at the Acme Saloon, talking loud and laughing. Selman walked in from behind, moved in quietly, and shot him in the back of the head. The gunman who so often took advantage of surprise died exactly the same way. He was 42. Selman stood trial, but the jury hung. To many, killing a notorious murderer didn't qualify as full-blown crime. Before there could be a retrial, Selman himself died in a saloon gunfight. The two men ended up buried in the same cemetery in El Paso. If they couldn't share space in life, the earth had to learn to hold them side by side. Belle Starr, the queen without a throne. Myra Maybelle Shirley was born into a respectable family, studied piano, was well educated. Her world fit better with ballrooms than trailside saloons. The Civil War tore that world apart. Her brother died fighting with Confederate guerrillas, her father went broke, the family moved, and her refined future dissolved. In Texas, Belle got close to men like Cole Younger, tied to the James Younger gang. She had relationships, watched the criminal life up close, and married Jim Reed, a horse thief and smuggler. When he was killed in a shootout with the law, she was left a young widow with children and almost no respectable options. That's when she embraced the underworld for good. She married Sam Starr, a Cherokee, and set up a ranch in Indian Territory that doubled as a refuge for fugitives. Younger's Bend became shorthand for outlaw hideout. Belle ran this bandit boarding house by taking a cut from robberies in exchange for shelter and protection. The press loved her. Reporters dubbed her the Bandit Queen, inventing crimes and pinning half the region's robberies on her. Belle played along, posing in flashy outfits, plumed hat, 2 revolvers on her hips, astride a horse with a dramatic name. Reality was probably less glamorous, but once again, whoever controls the story controls the image. She was only convicted once for horse theft and served 9 months in a Detroit prison, the first woman there for a serious crime. Sam Starr died in a gunfight, and Belle soon took up with a much younger Cherokee, Jim July. It was a volatile relationship full of fights and suspicion. On February 3rd, 1889, Belle was riding home at dusk along a lonely trail near Eufaula, Oklahoma. 2 shots rang out. One hit her back, another caught her head and face. She fell and died there in the mud at 40. No one was convicted. The suspect list is long: a violent son, a jealous younger husband, a feuding neighbor, a resentful outlaw. They all had motives. Nobody had proof that stuck. Belle Starr was buried at Younger's Bend under a headstone carved with a horse, a bell, and a star. Newspapers called her everything: bandit, harlot, thief, curse. Her daughter chose a softer epitaph about the light of hope. Between the exaggerations and slurs, we're left with a portrait of a woman moving through a world that offered few paths to anyone who stepped outside the norm. Whether she was villain or victim is up to each person to decide. Her death, at least, is still wrapped in shadow, just like her life. Black Bart, the robber who said, "Please." In a West full of men in crushed hats, stubble, and foul mouths, Charles Bowles stood out. An Englishman by birth, Civil War veteran, educated, polite. When his mining ventures in California failed, he was pushing 50, an age when most pioneers were more worried about grandchildren than guns. But Bowles invented a second act for himself. Wearing a light overcoat, bowler hat, and a flour sack over his head with 2 holes for eyes, he started robbing Wells Fargo stagecoaches. Afraid of horses, he did everything on foot. He climbed hills, slipped down ravines, and vanished into the landscape like a well-mannered ghost. In every robbery, his manners stayed impeccable. He didn't curse, asked the driver to hand over Wells Fargo's strongbox. Please, calmed frightened passengers, and refused to take money from women. His targets, he said, were the company and the mail. To top it off, he sometimes left poems at the crime scene, signing them Black Bart, the P08. For years, he humiliated Wells Fargo, making off with bulging money bags while mocking the company in verse. Then, in 1883, everything went wrong. At the same spot as his first hit, he tried to rob another stage. The strongbox was bolted to the floor, the job dragged on, and a passenger with a rifle, Jimmy Rolleri, appeared out of the brush at just the wrong or right time. Bart ran, took a bullet to the hand, and dropped a blood-stained handkerchief with a laundry mark. The laundry mark led detectives to a San Francisco washhouse, and from there to a respectable older gentleman who liked good restaurants and a quiet life. It was Charles Bowles. Arrested, he stayed witty and polite even at the station. Convicted for that single robbery, he got 6 years in San Quentin, served 4, and was released early for good behavior. When he came out, he insisted to reporters he'd left crime behind. After that, he simply disappeared. Some obituaries hint at a quiet death decades later, maybe in 1917. But officially, Black Bart's fate after walking out of prison is as foggy as those cold mornings when he stopped stagecoaches with a calm, "Good afternoon, sir." Big Nose Kate, the last living witness of Tombstone. Mary Catherine Horney, Big Nose Kate, was far more than a cruel nickname. Born in Hungary, well-educated, fluent in several languages, she came to the United States as a child and watched her life twist and turn until she ended up on the frontier. She worked as a nurse, dance hall girl, and saloon owner. She was not the kind of woman who accepted a place in the background. In one of those loud saloons, she met Doc Holliday. Two strong personalities, two people addicted to risk, two survivors. Their relationship was a roller coaster. Violent fights, dramatic breakups, irresistible reunions. Kate didn't just stand beside him, she often pulled him out of trouble. In one famous story, she supposedly set fire to a building to create a distraction so he could escape a charge. After Doc's death, Kate didn't become a movie legend or disappear in some flashy tragedy. She just went on. She ran boarding houses and care homes, lived for a time with a man named George Cummings, split up, moved, started again. When the old frontier towns were already fading into memory, Kate was still there, walking streets that now had pavement. Late in life, she lived at the Arizona Pioneers Home, a kind of retirement home for aging frontiersmen and women. There, she told stories of Tombstone, Doc, Wyatt Earp, gunfights, and long nights to young people who'd been born in the 20th century. On November 2nd, 1940, at 90 years old, she died. Think about that. A woman who drank, fought, and loved alongside one of the West's most famous gunfighters, lived long enough to see cars, airplanes, radio, and the opening storms of World War II. She was the last living witness of a world that, in most people's minds, already felt more like myth than reality. Tom Horn, the hired gun who became a scapegoat, or not. Tom Horn is the kind of figure who always seems half in shadow. Army scout in the Apache Wars, expert tracker, interpreter, Pinkerton operative, outlaw hunter, and, according to many sources, hired killer for big ranchers. During the campaign against Geronimo, he learned tracking and ambush techniques directly from the Apaches. Later, hired by powerful cattlemen, his skills were turned against a new target, small ranchers accused of rustling cattle. The barons wanted messages that couldn't be misunderstood. Tom, with his rifle, would deliver them. His reputation was icy precision. A single shot from hundreds of yards away, no witnesses. A stone under the victim's head was said to be his calling card. How many did he kill? No one knows for sure. What is clear is that he grew rich, charging high fees for services everyone preferred not to discuss in public. In 1901, a 14-year-old boy, Willie Nickel, was shot from a distance while wearing his father's hat. The family was locked in a bitter cattle dispute with neighbors. Public outrage exploded, fingers pointed at Tom Horn. A detective got him drunk, staged a casual conversation, and hid a stenographer nearby to record every word. Under the influence, Horn bragged about killings and made ambiguous comments tying himself to the case, or so they claimed. At trial, that half-confession, his bloody past, and the desperate desire for a big name to blame carried enormous weight. Horn was sentenced to hang. To the end, he insisted he was innocent of the boy's murder. Some say he was sacrificed to clean up the image of the big ranchers who had used him for years. Others believe he simply committed one more killing. Only this time, the victim was too young for the public to stomach. On November 20th, 1903, Tom Horn climbed the gallows in Cheyenne, Wyoming. They say he helped test the mechanism, as calm as ever. His last words were something like, "It's all right, friends." The trapdoor opened, and the man who so often hid behind a rifle sight became the one dangling in full view. To this day, the argument continues. Was he a ruthless vigilante, a paid assassin, or a disposable pawn of more powerful people? His grave holds a little of each version. Face Reeves, the lawman who beat death by outlasting it. If there's one story that shatters every classic Western cliché, it's Bass Reeves. Born enslaved in 1838 in a world that legally considered him property, he escaped during the Civil War, fled into Indian Territory, and lived for years among Cherokee, Creek, and Seminole communities, learning their languages, trails, and customs. After the war, when slavery was abolished, Reeves emerged as a free man with a skill set that made him invaluable. Tall, strong, an excellent rider, an ambidextrous marksman, and intimately familiar with the geography and people of Indian Territory. In 1875, Judge Isaac Parker, the hanging judge, needed federal deputies tough enough to enforce the law in a region notorious for lawlessness. Bass Reeves was chosen and became the first black deputy U.S. Marshal west of the Mississippi River. From there, his career reads like something invented. More than 3 Osaran criminals arrested, 14 killed in direct confrontations, countless long expeditions, clever disguises to infiltrate hideouts, and nab outlaws who thought they were too smart to be caught. Some scholars see him as the real inspiration for the Lone Ranger, operating in Indian Territory, a crack shot, obsessed with doing everything by the book, appearing and disappearing like a myth. The crucial difference is that Reeves didn't wear a mask, and besides criminals, he had to face the racism of a country that barely tolerated a black man wearing a badge. He survived it all. He rode through lands where so many men died in ambushes, faced entire gangs, and watched the West morph from wild frontier to organized statehood. When Oklahoma became a state and the territory changed, he ended his days as a city policeman, trading dusty trails for streets. In 1910, Bass Reeves died of natural causes at home, surrounded by family. No ambush, no staged execution, no shot in the back. After a lifetime sending others to prison or the gallows, he slipped out through the quietest door. In the West, a death like that almost feels like the grand prize. The Three Guardsmen, the last line of the law. Bill Tillman, Heck Thomas, and Chris Madsen made up a trio that, in practical terms, closed the books on a lot of stubborn outlaws. They became known as the Three Guardsmen, working as U.S. Marshals in Oklahoma Territory at a time when the Old West was literally ending. Tillman, a former buffalo hunter and ex-sheriff of Dodge City, was the classic calm man with sharp eyes, able to quiet an entire saloon just by walking in. Heck Thomas brought experience as a railroad detective and the kind of tenacity that made fugitives realize their run would be long, but not endless. Chris Madsen had a resume that included the Danish Army, the French Foreign Legion, and American military service, combining European discipline with frontier hardness. Together, they hunted down gangs like the Doolin Dalton outfit, Oklahoma's version of the Wild Bunch, notorious for train and bank robberies. Forcing those bands into extinction was a crucial part of turning the territory into a state with courts and structure. Heck Thomas and Chris Madsen eventually retired in relative peace, becoming respected figures in communities that now had schools, churches, and grocery stores. Bill Tillman, though, couldn't or wouldn't quit. Elderly but still stubborn, he accepted a job as Marshal of Cromwell, an oil town overflowing with corruption, violence, booze, and easy money. In 1924, at 70, he tried to arrest a drunken, out-of-control federal agent named Wiley Lynn. Instead of listening to the old lawman, Lynn pulled a gun and shot him. Tillman fell in the street with a bullet in his chest. The man who spent decades cleaning up towns and rounding up outlaws died on a sidewalk while trying to impose law on a corrupt colleague. Lynn went to trial and was acquitted by a shady jury. Months later, he too died in murky circumstances. In the end, violence caught up with him as well. The Three Guardsmen left an impressive tally of captured outlaws, but their real legacy was something else, signaling, through their own work, that the Old West was closing down. When Bill Tillman fell, it was almost symbolic, like the West itself saying goodbye to the old way of settling things. When death closes the door, it opens the legend. From Billy the Kid and Jesse James to Bass Reeves and Annie Oakley, one thing is obvious. Nobody chooses how they die, but the way they go helps write the kind of story the world tells afterward. Some were shot in the back, betrayed by people they called friends. Others faded slowly in sickbeds, annoyed by the irony of not getting a cinematic ending. Some had their corpses fought over, others vanished without a trace. Some share a graveyard with a supposed great love probably invented, and others swapped their guns for a typewriter. In the end, what we call the Old West today is a blend of fact, exaggeration, forgetting, music, movies, and selective biography. Death, in many of these stories, is the moment where real life ends and legend begins. And maybe that's why these tales keep coming back. Because in every shot, every betrayal, every old man dying quietly in a bed far from the prairies, we don't just see the end of a character, we see the end of an entire era.